Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. If you're here for PLMA's first load management dialogue of the year, you are in the right place, and we will get started in about 2 minutes time. So please stand by, and we're in for a very interesting conversation today. In the meantime, welcome to PLMA sustaining members, and also to our advisory, associate, and academic members. PLMA is a member-driven organization, and so of course this particular webinar is open to both members and non-members. And if you are a non-member, of course, we welcome you and would love for you to consider joining us. More information on the website. Okay. All right, well, thank you for being here, everybody. Welcome to today's Load Management Dialogue, and we are delighted to be offering this as our first dialogue of the year to really take on what are the load flexibility trends that we anticipate in 2026. Our host for today is PLMA board member Jenny Roehm of Schneider Electric, and I am going to pass the floor over to Jenny, and she will kick us off with our conversation today. So Jenny, welcome and thank you for being here, and here we go.
Thank you. And I'm really excited to be here today with Peter Kelly-Detwiler. Peter's been in the energy industry for 30 years and is a strategic consultant and author, and is a great font of insight and just fun stories about where we are today and what we're going to be doing. So Peter, thank you so much for joining this conversation today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I think this might be the third time we've done this, and it's always just a great joy. So thanks for having me back.
Well, hopefully, I know the first two times you did this, you did it with Olivia. So hopefully I do just as good as she did. So last time you were here, you talked about several themes and trends that were going to be impacting 2025. And as I was looking through that past discussion, I think a lot of those trends are probably still relevant today. So we'll kind of talk about those three trends that you talked about in 2025, and we'll talk about, are they still an influence, or has their influence changed for 2026? So I know that you had some special things you wanted to share. So do you want to share those now, or do you want to share those in a moment?
Let's pop up the slides, and we can start to paint with the canvas, if you will. All right. So the watchword, I think, for 2026 is going to be flexibility. And what's interesting is, and why is that the case? It's because we're seeing stresses across the grid, particularly on the demand side, but also we're seeing aging infrastructure on the supply side, mostly at the distribution level, but then also, coal plants retiring, that sort of thing. So I went to, because AI is such a big part of this, I thought, well, let's engage AI in the conversation. So first I said to AI, hey, could you do like some bowling pins with flexibility in the middle of the lane? And so it did, but it didn't put the pins where I wanted them, and it was spelled flexibility. So even though then I went back and checked, did I misspell it? No, Gemini got it wrong. So then I said, hey, jazz that up a little bit and make it more, put transmission towers where the lines, where the bowling pins should be, and have some electricity in there. So this is what it came up with, which I thought was kind of intriguing. And I start to use AI in more and more of my slides, although we all know it uses a lot of electricity every time we're using it in this inference approach that I have done so here. But the point is, we really have a situation where our load for about 20 years was this period of what I call flat, dumb, and happy, where we didn't see any real load growth for almost 20 years, partly because we had efficient technologies like LED lighting supplanting, our old stupid lighting, which is, the filaments overhead. There were heaters masquerading as sources of illumination. Also because we had variable speed drives and other more efficient technologies, and because we outsourced a lot of our infrastructure in industry to China. So pretty much flat. And then you start to introduce electric vehicles and heat pumps and so on, beneficial electrification, it starts to grow a little bit. And then all of a sudden, you've got ChatGPT popping out of the box in late 2022, people starting adopting those models, Google, Meta, Amazon, Anthropic, and everybody else starting to build their large language models, making those investments. And suddenly you've got a really sclerotic supply side where nothing's really happening, and this huge influx of potential demand where they're willing to pay almost anything for the next megawatt and megawatt hour. So now capacity is the limiting factor, and anything we can do to increase more flexibility in the grid will allow the integration of more of those data centers that are, again, almost willing to pay anything for that next available electron. So that was this slide. And if we can move to the next one. Then I wanted to point out as well that really when we think about the value of flexible load, demand response, and the aggregated DERs into the virtual power plants that essentially we can shape and mold and treat like another supply resource. I basically, you start to look at, well, how do you value that? And it's really all about avoided costs. It's avoided costs of infrastructure, it's avoided costs of energy, certainly during those high price volatile periods. And in a market like PJM or ISO New England, your formal demand charges. So then I basically went back to Gemini and said, hey, draw me a picture of William Tell with an apple on his head that says demand charges and an arrow that goes over his head. Well, the arrow in the first drawing was going to hit him right in the forehead. Gemini didn't quite get that right. So the avoided cost would kill it. And so then I said, okay, move the arrow this way and that way. And finally, after 3 or 4 times, Gemini kind of figured out what I wanted. But if you haven't interacted with artificial intelligence in some meaningful way, shape, or form, I highly advise that you do. Start playing with Gemini, start playing with Perplexity, etc. Ask it questions and ask it the same question multiple ways. I asked recently, Gemini, what do you think about data centers and the move from the large language models, the big training models that are like gigawatt scale, to inference, and the smaller models that are going to give us the data instantaneously? And it came back with something, and I said, I don't like your answer. I think you're wrong in this area. Please rethink it. And it came back and said, oh yeah, you're right. One of the things you'll find, AI is just a massive suck up to people. It tries to ingratiate itself everywhere. So you got to be a little bit thoughtful about how you use it. But it is in building slide decks and writing and so on. It's like having a counterpart across the table that can edit and make suggestions and so on and so forth. I just put together a book proposal on Winter Storm Uri, and I got really great feedback and suggestions and some sources from both Perplexity and Gemini. So enough of a plug for it. My point simply being that more and more of us are using this every day, and more people will be using it within the next couple of years. And one other thing about it, I highly recommend you read, that just came out yesterday, I think in Substack, the CEO of Anthropic talking about the promises and risks of AI. Their model is starting to do its own coding for the next versions of the model without any more humans involved. That's where we are now. So understand more about it, because it's going to shape our whole world, but it's certainly going to impact the energy world as well. So these are the 2 slides I put out there to sort of tee up the conversation and get the questions going and the juices flowing.
All right, these are great. And I am amused by the avoided costs. At first going for the forehead, and now we're just going above the head. So as we get started, I want everybody who is listening in, if you have any questions along the way, please drop them in the chat. There were a few questions that were sent in ahead of time, and this is an ongoing conversation. So feel free to chime in if you have some questions, and we'll pull those thoughts in as well. So given that, the first trend that you had talked about last year was AI for the win. And it's, very fortuitous that you start this particular conversation around AI as well. So we know there's a lot of load growth, but you hinted at the promise of the benefits that AI can bring us. How do how do you see that trend is going to be? Is that a change from last year to this year, or do you see new impacts from AI in 2026?
Most of the adoption of AI still has not occurred for most industries. I mean, you're starting to hear more and more about agentic AI and CEOs kind of pushing it through. And some of the first use cases where they just hope people would pick it up, employees pick it up and adopt it, hasn't really quite been there yet. At the same time that the models are getting better. And for example, if you listen to Jensen Huang in his keynote at the GTC conference, he talks about how they're building these CUDAs, these specialized use cases, essential or capabilities for every single industry. So you have companies like PG&E and other utilities saying, oh, we're going to start adopting AI. But when you really think about the adoption of a tool like this, yes, it ultimately could provide us the situational awareness so that at every single distribution asset on the grid, we would know what the thermal stress is, how often it hits those thermal stresses, when it would likely to need to be replaced if use were X% more, and so on. You could get really granular and start to map out your whole grid. But if you could do that, well, what's the institutional capability to take that knowledge and make it actionable? So you have the question that I start with is, what could you do with a tool that gave you accurate information, ubiquitous, anywhere you wanted it, and you could essentially ask it questions about anything in your system of systems that is the power grid? So whether it's inventory of fuel on site in a coal plant, or what's the thermal stress right now on that transformer at 95 degrees, and what's it going to look like at 100 degrees? And when is it likely to need to be replaced? Like, you could ask all those questions. The real challenge is knowing what the questions are to ask, and then having an institution that's set up to make sense of it. So let's say you're a utility. Right now, you've got a forecasting group, you have a group that does gen planning or procurement, you have your transmission planning group, your distribution planning group, your HR group, your customer care facing group, all that. Okay, so all the distributed energy resources and the virtual power plant stuff, that's located down at the customer level, which means you have to involve the customer care group. What you end up doing with that and actualizing those DERs, where would you put them first? In theory, you'd put them behind the highest avoided costs. If this transformer is going to cost me X to replace and it's going to take place next year, that's where I'm going to want to focus my DER investments. Okay, so if you do that, first of all, the distribution or transmission planning group, easy for me to say, they're the ones that have to map out the avoided costs. Then they have to figure out, well, what are those assets behind the meter whose behavior we could change? How many EVs are there? How many water heaters, etc.? And then how do we reach them? How do we design programs and compensate them and create the compensatory mechanisms, the incentives, all that stuff? And that involves a lot of econometric investigation. It's a system of systems, so it's really complex. And what it means is you have to break down the vertical silos and go horizontal with a lot of this stuff using this amazing new tool, which hasn't quite fully reached fruition and been adopted yet. But it will, because the avoided costs are so high and the stresses we're facing on the grid are so large right now.
So a couple of the things I think that came up as you were talking for me was the ubiquitous, and there's a lot of silos that need to be broken down within the utility. That part is true. The other one you said was accurate, and I know that not all of the data within a utility about its system, about its customers is accurate.
True.
And so what are we to expect? I mean, you already said, Gemini gets it wrong. Gemini's a suck up.
Yeah.
What do we do with inaccurate data, and how do we make sure that what we're getting out of it is the right answers?
That's an interesting one. So in that article yesterday by the CEO of Anthropic, he's actually talking about ethics in these models. And by the way, you can't look into them and know what they're doing anymore. They're inscrutable now. They're beyond our ability to pull them apart and understand what's happening in them. And the way you can figure that out is you ask them the right questions and you sort of test them. You could do a similar sort of thing with your data. which is to say, okay, how do we assess this data for reasonableness? Because a lot of the data we know is just junk. And if you looked at it, you would say, well, that doesn't make any logical sense to start with. And so with your large data sets, you could begin to apply artificial intelligence to develop correlative, relationships and know what's good data and what's junk data. And of course, as well, I just had a smart meter installed in my home by National Grid a couple of weeks ago, and they sent me a bunch of information of how I can figure out to use it. But they say that in theory, I should be able to tell my different appliances footprints and so on. I don't know if that's true or not, but I do know that at some point we're going to be able to tease out more of that information and assess it for accuracy and reasonableness and then do something about it. And the other key piece of this is if you start to really create this environment where these one-way cart paths, which are distribution networks, become these two-way major thoroughfares, you're going to have bidirectional flows of power. First of all, you stop, you change temperature set points and use less at certain times, but then you start to do your bidirectional flows with batteries, EVs, etc. Now you have really interesting frequency and voltage issues that you have to understand you didn't have to understand before. And so those bits of data also need to be superimposed on top of everything else that's going on. And you have to have that real-time situational awareness that informs the grid operators as to, what is really happening out there in the field. And how do you then take all that and aggregate it at the right levels? A couple of years ago for Forbes, I interviewed the psychologist for ERCOT, who built the Make-Homer maps that kept the grid operators from being overloaded by too much data so that they'd be paralyzed by just having too much information that wasn't useful. And by the same token, as we get more and more information from the field, we have to figure out where to aggregate it and how to weed out what's useful and what's not, and also make sense of it and know that it's real. So I think you raise some really valid questions. We're still early on that path right now, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done. But we are starting to see some use cases that we can coordinate and aggregate. Was it September in California between Sunrun and Tesla? They organized 539 megawatts of batteries behind the meters, over 100,000 of them. And they dispatched them and dropped the demand curve down, boom, just like that for an hour. So we're starting to see these incipient signs that things like that can be done.
Thank you. So I know we'll come. I'm doing a quick check. I don't see my chat window, so I don't know if we have any questions there. We do not. I think we'll end up probably kind of looping in. I think AI is going to be a theme through a lot of what we talk about.
Yeah.
One of the second trend that you guys talked about for 2025 was innovations in value streams, wholesale versus retail versus deferral of building either transmission or generation. In our prep call, we talked a little bit about the changes in the wholesale market and data centers and all this additional. We have assets retiring, we have aging infrastructure, and we have this huge demand. And what are the impacts to the market based on like those different parts of the balancing of the scales?
Right, a great question. So first of all, most of it's not happening at the distribution level there. There, the cost drivers are aging infrastructure, much of which is 50 or 60 years old and has to be replaced soon in an inflationary environment. Now, why is the inflationary environment happening? Because there's demand for more electricity. And so there was a great article this morning. Why are EVs costing more? Because the chips in the cars, not just EVs, but regular cars, are now being all the silicon's headed towards data centers. So that's inflationary. What about, the grain-oriented steel that's required for transformers? What about copper? All that stuff. They're building these massive data centers. They want the transformers. They want the turbines. All that is going up in price. So, there's a lot of indirect impacts, even in the distribution sector. But if you look at the wholesale market, the thing to really bear in mind is just the enormous scale. Let's take 3 data points. First of all, Texas. Peak in Texas in 83, they hit their system peak, and it was 85,500 megawatts. In Texas right now, they have over 200,000 megawatts of large loads seeking to interconnect to the grid. It's about, I think it's like 240 or something. So it's almost 3 times the size of the peak demand, the record peak demand in their system. Or let's shift to Dominion, where I think we might have talked about them last year. Dominion peaked out at 17,003 last year. And 17.3. They had 40,000 megawatts of data center requests or contracts as of December of 2024. As of a year later, that number is up to 47,000, and they have about either in construction or recently completed or committed to pay for the infrastructure, or the transmission, the wires and the poles. They got about 15,000 megawatts of data load right there. So it's almost equal to what they have served. Of course, Loudoun County, 70% of the email in the world goes through there, so that's the epicenter. But then you look at PJM, right? PJM's got all this data center from AEP Ohio because they have the 765 kV lines, plus they got Dominion. So how do these costs manifest? Well, the most concrete example so far is the base residual auctions from 25, 26, 26, 27, and 27, 28, all of which took place roughly within the last year because they hadn't had an auction for a while PJM was trying to figure out some rules. So they compressed them so they happened every 6 months, kind of like what we're looking at now with one storm after another whacking the East Coast. You barely get time to shovel out from one, the next one comes. So the prior 3 years, the average RTO capacity clearing price in the base residual was $50, $34, and $29. So let's say average roughly $35. Okay. Then the 25-26 year price came in at $269.90. Okay. Then Governor Shapiro rightfully freaked out. That's the technical term. And went to PJM and said, we'd like to have a floor and a cap. We'll do a floor of 175, which was higher than any other capacity price had cleared, and a cap of 325. PJM reluctantly accepted. They went to FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, blessed it. So then they have the auction this year. The price clears at 329.17. The way they deal with unforced capacity, it was essentially 325, but there's some adders. So here's the interesting thing. This is for the 26-27 one. PJM ran the simulation without the cap. Price comes in at 388. Now, cost of new entrants way higher than that. If you're building a new generator, it's even higher than that. So then they ran the auction this year, the one that just happened for 27-28. Price came in at 333.44, still has that 325 cap, but unforced capacity, U cap makes it a little higher. They ran the simulation, 529.80. Okay, so now you see these capacity prices, which used to represent a small portion of the wholesale revenue, now more than 25%. Now, the interesting thing, there's a couple of them. Next year, the caps come off. It was only a 2-year provision there. So what happens then? Well, you have, among other things, Elcon, the large industrial consumers. Last May, they went to FERC and said, you know what's driving these prices? It's the data centers. And it's not the ones that are built. It's the ones in the forecast. So we better make sure we get the forecast right. And I don't know what FERC has done about that particular issue, but they have now the ANOPR that they've put out. But then the other thing that happened was the independent market monitor came in and said, what if we ran those auctions again without the forecasted and existing data center load? An existing data center load is tiny. It's like 600 megawatts in AEP Ohio versus like 30 gigs of interconnection requests. It's small. It's all forecasted. And by the way, PJM just reduced their forecast this year, admitting that they were wrong. Not by that much, but by some. So the independent market monitor says, if you rip out the data center load over those 3 auctions, you rip out $23 billion, over 40% of the total cost of those auctions. That's the inflationary impact we're seeing from forecasted, a little bit of actual, but mostly forecasted data center load because of the magnitude and the speed with which it's slamming into the ecosystem of our energy systems.
So so many questions going through my head on this one. So in data centers, some of the conversations I've had with others around data centers is that a company who wants to build will put in requests to multiple different locations. So they're looking at different places across the country. Are there possibilities for like mitigating how they're doing this? Because it is that, I want to build a 600 megawatt data center, but I'm asking 10 different utilities for this. And that means that that's showing up as, 6,000.
Right. Yes. And the estimates of that phantom load is somewhere between 3x and 10x based on, if you talk to various utility CEOs or practitioners in the space. And why? Because the speed to power is the critical piece. It's kind of like that old fairy tale with Rapunzel spinning straw into gold. In this case, you spin silicon and the chips and data and electricity essentially into useful information. And the goal is to become the leading engines in the world. And everybody knows it's going to be 3 or 4 companies, the same way the search engines were dominated by, Google. And if you don't believe me, you can go ask Jeeves, as I like to say. Same sort of thing. Everybody's racing. And there's also this geopolitical issue, which is the United States does not want China to get there first. A lead of a couple months matters. So there's that whole thing, which is why the Trump administration is pushing this so hard. If you look at the interconnection queues on the supply side, same sort of thing. If you had $1 billion and you were a developer, you'd put 5 chips on the board, right, in different ISOs, and then go, okay, if this one is close to fruition or gets the approval, I'll pull the other 4 off. It's one of the reasons the interconnection queues have been so messed up and why FERC required higher deposits on a go-forward basis. So the same sort of thing has been happening on the data center side. Now, what's happened so far is, like in Texas, they put Senate Bill 6 out that said to all applicants in Texas, you have to make it known in your applications where else you're applying, but only in Texas, not in the rest of the country. So you still only get a limited view in the microscope of what's really on the Petri dish. Some of the other jurisdictions are trying to do the same thing, but nobody has as yet said, if you want to play, you got to show us all the cards on the table and every single chip you have, that you've anteed up. And so that issue around forecasting, because of these phantom loads, is really, really difficult to deal with right now. At the same time, we're also facing, more and more localized opposition, and we're also seeing ratepayers beginning to say, well, if these things do get built, how do we protect the other ratepayers so that they aren't on the hook for a lot of the infrastructure that the data centers may or may not use? And we actually just saw a contract in Michigan for 19 years, which is a take or pay contract and so if you don't build the data center, you're still on the hook for paying DTE for 19 years because they're going to build infrastructure that they have to rate base over, say, a 30-year period. So there's a lot of moving parts on that one, but there's an enormous amount of inflation in the numbers right now, and nobody knows quite what it looks like.
So as we look at kind of the affordability, because this is really impacting affordability for everyone, not just
everyone. Yeah.
It's not just the data centers. And I know there's been a lot of claims that the data centers are paying for their own way. They're buying their own generation. And this is obviously, they might be doing that, but there's still these other impacts. So the other trend that you guys talked about back in 2025 was affordability and rates. And we've started to meander that direction, and, avoided costs are higher. These data centers have a lot of money to throw at problems. So kind of in a multi-tiered question, PLMA is really focused on load flexibility. Mm-hmm. And can flexibility really address some of the constraints, congestions, bottlenecks, issues created by all of this incredible amount of demand, phantom or real, that's being put out there?
Sure. Well, let's look at the flexibility on the data side first, and then we'll talk about the flexibility of everybody else. Bearing in mind that if the value of the next electron is way more valuable to the data center, then they should be willing to pay other demand response companies more money to get capacity reductions over there so that they can add more over here. Like, it's a classic arbitrage opportunity in some way, shape, or form. if you get into looking at data centers, you run right back in the interconnection issue, you run smack into available infrastructure. So it's a capacity issue. And it's more of a capacity around transmission than it is around capacity in gen, although that falls right behind it. Okay. So there was a great study done by Tyler Norris out of the Nichols Institute and Duke University last year, basically saying, if you could reduce, say, 100 peak hours of consumption, I don't remember the exact hours, you could add so many gigawatts more of data centers to the grid because you've taken away that peak stress. Of the 8,760 hours of the year, if you can reduce the top 1% of them, you can cut costs for the grid by around 8%, 9%, right? So it's not that many hours we're talking about. So everybody jumped on that study and said, well, that makes a lot of sense. And there have been some recent studies coming out more about that. Then the question is, okay, how would you create that flexibility? Well, the easiest sort of simple answer is don't change your behavior, just throw batteries behind the meter. And some data centers are doing that. There's one in Washington State that they got their interconnection approved more quickly because they're bringing batteries behind the meter. Southwest Power Pool, if you commit to interruption, you can, for X number of hours, being flexible that way, they will guarantee a 90-day interconnection process to get a new data center online because you're not adding additional capacity requirements to the grid. Now, so batteries and behind the meter supply infrastructure, storage infrastructure is one answer. The next one is, well, what if I can actually change the behavior of what's going on in these LLMs, the large language models, these things that tear through the world's data and create these neural networks and developing the contextual relationships between all these bits of data the same way a human brain does. And a lot of these models now use trillions of weights and tokens, about 20 tokens for every parameter. So huge amounts of data, and they can run for 6 months or more, some of them. And so it was thought that they had to run in sort of the monolithic form, even though they bounce up and down and cause frequency issues like you read about. But now with EPRI and some others and a company called Emerald AI, they've proven in Phoenix that you could reduce consumption by about 25%. So now they're putting in a data center in Virginia to really test that theory on a broader scale. So maybe in the training side of things, you have that kind of flexibility. But the next piece of the equation is kind of like, okay, the baby's in the crib and it's learning to think and it looks at the thing that's spinning around over its head and pretty soon it can walk and then after a while it learns how to read and so on. Now it's this thinking being like an LLM. Okay, so now what happens next? Let's take the example of autonomous vehicles. So the LLM part, the training, teaches the Waymo what to do so that the Waymo, when it's driving down the road and has all its optical sensors, it sees and recognizes that's a cat, that's a horse, that's a dog, that's a woman. Huh, what's that woman pushing? Oh, that's a stroller. Okay, that's a woman in a stroller. Okay, now we have to create these relationships. Woman plus stroller is more important than cat. Okay, so you've built all that into your LLM, into that large language model. And you and I, by the way, before we got on this call, I wanted to amuse myself and I just typed in, hang on, baby, Friday's coming. And there was a cat and the picture showed up. It took about 1/10 of a second. It was not a very low latency event, but I didn't need low latency for the cat. Okay, that I wanted to see the picture hanging from the tree. So now same cat comes down that tree and comes across the road as the woman is walking across with this stroller, and my Waymo sees both of them and swerves to the left, and for that cat, Friday is never coming. That is a low latency inference type of decision, okay? So inference is faster because you're making use of the trained models. So what happens with inference is you start to put those data centers, way smaller ones, closer to population centers or finance centers or places where you need faster inference type responses. Also searches, when we're asking for pictures to be built or querying Perplexity AI, that's inference. So inference generally requires always on and doesn't allow for a 25% cut for 3 or 4 hours for the capacity we need for the grid. So far, as far as we understand it today. So these are some of the issues we still have to understand is, first of all, how many LLMs do we need? How long will they be there in these massive big boxes? Do we still need LLM capability 10 years from now? What are they crunching then? And then when this stuff starts to go from vertical to horizontal out into inference land, how many of these data centers are we going to have? What sizes are they going to be? And are they always on? So, or maybe there's less time demand in the middle of the night when people are sleeping. So now you create this same peakiness that we have with a lot of our thermal loads, for air conditioning and stuff, because it mimics human behavior. These things we don't really know yet. And these are some of the challenges for grid planners, again, with demand that could dwarf our existing system.
So AI is both good and both evil when it comes to our grid. When we were talking back about the innovations in the value streams, we sort of skipped over the distribution side, and you said that's a lot about just kind of replacing infrastructure. But thinking about like the growth there or the changes there, both with rooftop solar and with EVs, and while the investments in what's happening on the wholesale market's pretty big, for the rest of us in our world, it comes down to those of us doing webinars from work from home. That is all in the distribution grid. So innovations with how we rebuild our grid. Our grid is old. We've got aging infrastructure. How are we going to invest in it in a way to kind of balance out the rest of the challenges on the wholesale side?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And so if you think about it, and we'll just take, I think I might have cited this study before, but just to give you the magnitude. So California, the PUC asked a consulting group, Kavala, a couple of years ago, what would it cost if we electrified every vehicle in the state in terms of upgrading our distribution infrastructure? And the answer was somewhere between $30 and $50 billion if we didn't change the way we did anything, like managed charging, that sort of thing. So that just gives you a massive price tag, right? And you could extrapolate that to different grids around the country. Well, clearly, we couldn't do all that all at once. Among other things, it would create massive inflationary pressures. So just like all the investments we make as humans all the time, we have to prioritize. So now you basically have to get back to that heat map type of situation and say, okay, we know we have to turn over a lot of this inventory pretty soon because it's aging and it's suffering more and more thermal stresses, especially if you get into a warmer climate and you have more end uses like EV charging. And one other thing, by the way, artificial intelligence ends up in here pretty soon. And inference ends up in here, which means the batteries are going to be bigger and more powerful, which means more juice has to flow through the system. We're going to see a migration of more electrons to the grid edge as well as we get more data intensive, which means more stresses on the distribution infrastructure. And we're already looking at a situation where a report that just came out recently suggested that the cost of requests from utilities, IOUs, to public utilities commissions was twice as much this year through Q3 of 2025 as it was the year before. So already we're seeing a lot of requests for investments that'll be rate-based and flow back in terms of demand charges to ratepayers. Now, if we are not careful, we would replace things in a sort of monolithic fashion, just saying, okay, we'll just replace all these things without really knowing what they do or how soon they need to be stressed. And a good example of smart is like Burbank, the utility. They looked at all their transformers and which ones were stressed and which ones weren't and which one had spare capacity, and they moved some of it around, right? So there are ways to do that, but for us to mitigate and manage our costs, we have to do two things. We have to replace only what we need to when we absolutely need to. And the first thing is to understand when are those things being stressed, how often, and what's stressing them, and can we change the behavior behind the meters to reduce those stresses? And of course, flow more megawatt hours across the existing system. You see all kinds of estimates of what's the load factor. I've seen 43%. I've seen north of 50% for the average flows across the grid. But either number suggests there's a lot more headroom there. So if we flowed more megawatt hours in the evening hours, say to distributed batteries, we wouldn't have to push as much new equipment out into the grid. in terms of replacing transformers and all those things. So smarter use first, focused investments in the right places second, right? And that requires, again, building out the maps of where your cost structures are. One of the challenges there is that requires software and things that typically aren't rate-based in the utility world. And so it requires a rethink from regulators to really understand what's the potential here, what's the cost here, and what's the most cost-effective way to begin to solve these problems.
Which, if we had good data and ubiquitous
yes.
exposure, we could ask AI
yes.
those questions.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think you could start by asking AI the question now and ask it different ways. One of my friends who took a sabbatical for 6 months and lives in this space, he drives like an hour every day, and he talks to Gemini and he asks it the same question like 5 different ways to understand its biases. With these tools, you could start to ask the questions and then sort of look at the answers where you empirically know what the truth is, and then dig deeper. But again, it's going to take an investment of a team of people interfacing with those tools to get the answers that they need.
Sort of a little bit of a side rabbit. The question in the chat was, what's the percent of the total power consumption? What percent of total power consumption is from inference versus training? Have you seen those numbers?
You know, they change so fast. I don't think anybody really knows. But one other interesting data point around that. So you might have recalled when DeepSeek announced last year out of China, hey, we figured out a way to not brute force this the way the Americans have with chips and throwing electricity at it. We did open source coding, and we used a lot fewer chips and a lot less energy. And what happened that day? Constellation's energy price crashed, stock price, NVIDIA's price went down. And then Baidu came out with ERNIE 1.0 and 3.0 and said, we've achieved the same sort of thing. Well, when that happened, the same day or the day after, Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, he was on X and he simply tweeted out Jevons paradox, i.e., if Coke is 50% cheaper, we'll drink more of it. So if the LLMs use fewer chips and less electricity, they can build the models for less money and therefore lower the subscription cost to everybody using them. And then you're pushing out more models for inference and less for LLM. So we still don't even know, like, for example, the last chip that just came out, the Vera Rubin chip, that was it's now in the field. It was announced last year. It's now in the field. Jensen Huang the other day, the CEO of NVIDIA, said, we may not require the same sorts of chilling in those racks as we had before. And whose price crashed then? Honeywell and the other Johnson Controls, because they think this is going to be the biggest AC driven market in the history of the planet. So my point being, the tech changes, the use case changes, the chilling technologies change, and we don't even know yet what is the human appetite for the information at what cost. We don't know any of this right now.
Okay, I'm going to do a hard pivot to some of the questions that were sent in earlier. I know we're doing well, but I want to get all this stuff covered. So totally different than all the stuff we've been talking about, or maybe not. Somebody said, particularly looking for winter peak load reduction opportunities in a community that is primarily natural gas heated.
Okay, so if you're dealing with pipeline constraints, which you probably are in this situation, because that's what you'd be looking at. So first and foremost, you have to think about whether it's the electric power system or that. You're actually addressing a thermal problem, right? In the power grid, the reason we have the spikes in the summer and the winter, it's insulation for the most part. If our homes and our businesses were better insulated, we wouldn't be as peaky. We'd be more like that, right? Batteries kind of do the same thing as insulation in that they store energy. So instead of insulation, we've stored energy there and release it. With gas, it's not like you can have this massive LNG tank in your backyard to use like a battery. But the first thing you can do is think about, well, what are the end uses? And certainly reduction of, thermostat or more insulation, those sorts of issues. But you have to kind of look at your end uses and then figure out how correlative are they with peak and what's driving, those numbers. And then what are your avoided costs and what investments does it make sense to do? One of the ones we're starting to see more and more with gas is switching over, for example, from gas heating to electric heat pump heating. And it actually is way more efficient because gas, you're burning the therms. With electric heat pumps, you're taking either ambient heat and heat from the air outside, even when it's down to 0 degrees. There's still heat out there, and so the conversion efficiencies are good. But if you have ground source, for every kilowatt hour you use, you're getting about 4 kilowatt hours of free heating and cooling from the earth. So again, these are all around avoided costs and alternative technologies and how you're using the gas in the first place.
I think so. I used to work for a utility in the Pacific Northwest, and this was something that we were looking at is we had winter peaks, electrical peaks, but when we were looking for loads to reduce, you look for the big ones, thermal, but it was gas heating that was being used. So, yep. Trying to think what would be opportunities for doing that. And in some ways, I would think batteries would be a perfect solution for that because you're trying to reduce your electrical peak, but you don't have the luxury of changing the heating and cooling of the building, right, to achieve those electrical changes.
Yeah, batteries are becoming increasingly cost effective. I mean, that Wright's law, experience curve is pushing the price of battery down more and more and more. And now in China, for example, you're starting to see salt-based batteries, sodium batteries entering into the grid, not yet on-prem, but you're starting to see it as energy storage, not just in vehicles, but in the grid as well. So I wouldn't discount the fact that batteries could become more and more cost effective in more and more places. And there's also this emerging secondary market now for used batteries. Which, for example, what's Redwood, the company that J.B. Straubel, who spun out of Tesla, he's now using all these used EV batteries, and they're using for data centers. But you're also starting to see them in commercial sectors. So storage is going to get cheaper and cheaper over time.
So usually people, when they talk about storage in the same breath, they're also talking about other renewables for integration. So kind of at the opening of this conversation, we talked about retirement of coal plants. And so we're losing some of this base load. We're bringing in a bunch of intermittent loads, whether it's solar or wind. Storage isn't quite there to handle all of the loads. And, people are starting to talk about SMRs. So thinking a big picture, we've got lots of policy changes that have been happening. And how do you see how policy is affecting kind of our what we would traditionally look at as our generation mix? And
yeah. Well, policy drives a lot. I mean, you see the DOE extending the life of some coal plants, even despite the objections of the local utilities and states, because there are costs involved there. And then, of course, we had policy, the IRA, that was driving a lot of investments in wind and solar and storage. But when you think about the grid as a whole, and first of all, I will state that I think that, except for maybe AI, climate change is the greatest potential threat to human well-being. I think it's one of these things where, just like old age, it creeps up on you and suddenly you're 65 years old. You think it's a problem for tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow until it's not. And so that has to be in the policy in ways that it was before and isn't now. At the same time, I do think that the proponents who say, well, if you just had enough wind and solar and storage, you could solve for X. The answer is no. We just saw that with Winter Storm Fern, that if we don't have fuel that is stored on site or is readily accessible, I mean, wind was helpful at certain times in Texas. Solar was awesome in New England. The day before the storm came in, we had like 3.5 gigawatts of solar on rooftops, displacing the need to burn oil. What happened after the storm? The next day, there was no duck curve in New England because all the solar panels were covered in snow. And so you see grid planners like PJM and now ISO New England, they're going through these capacity reaccreditation processes saying, let's look at all of our assets in the worst possible situations. because we can't plan for the best. We have to plan for the worst. When people don't, or assets don't show up to the party when it hits the fan, that's when we need to know what's going to be there. And so it can't be an over reliance on gas. We saw that during Uri. Of course, they winterized a lot of that after that. In PJM, Elliott, that's what led to the reaccreditation of gas. They dropped an NGCC capacity value from 96% to 74% because they didn't get the gas during Elliott. So, you have to think about all these different pieces and how they fit together. And what we do see is robustness is diversity of supply. The puzzle has to have more than one or two resources in it. That's just the reality of today. Now, batteries help a lot, but there's still a load and a supply asset. When we get to, say, Forum Energy's 100-hour battery, the iron air one, or Noom, which just tested their air storage product for 100 hours, and it's coming along. We're going to see longer duration storage soon, but it's not there yet. And bearing in mind, most of these have round trip efficiencies between 40 and 60%. So they lose half their energy between charging and discharging versus lithium ion, which is around 90% RTEs. So again, like there's no magic bullet. There's a basket full of different things that help us get through. And I think we need to make sure we're not too ideologically wedded to any one of them. And of course, flexibility and investments in efficiency, they're the sine qua non that has to happen first.
You touched on this. The next question I was going to ask you, you kind of touched on it, but I'd like to drive it home a little bit more. The needs of reliability and resilience in driving investments. So we talked a lot about like storms and having fuel on site, but there's also as we look at climate change and what it's doing to wildfires and how that's changing. So this all has to do with like investments in the grid. And what are your thoughts there for how those two things are really driving the investments that we need to make?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about wildfire, if you look at what happened with PG&E, where they went bankrupt after the Camp Fire, and then you look at Idaho Power Pacific Corp, where they paid out hundreds of millions of dollars in wildfire damage related claims. And those numbers are just going to go up and up. Same thing with Texas, with Exelon in the north of Texas with a fire there.
SoCal Edison.
Yeah. I mean, we're clearly in a new world where if someone were to tell me in 20 years a wildfire will rip through the Adirondacks or Vermont, I would say that is entirely feasible, even though we haven't experienced it yet in our lifetimes, because we now see extreme drought where we haven't seen it before. And so now every utility has to have a public safety power shutoff plan. If they don't, to my mind, they're being negligent right now. That is, they need to know when to de-energize the lines in the event of these kinds of high winds and drought situations proactively. So now wildfire detection, that's something AI, by the way, is really, really good at. Getting much better at all the time. But it's another cost, all these climate related costs. And part of the challenge of society is we have market economies and all the externalities we just throw out the window. If you had a slaughterhouse and you just threw all the nonsense into the stream and it went down to communities downstream and they had to deal with it, and you sold your hamburger for $1 because you didn't have the sewage treatment facility in and made it someone else's problem, we've done that with our atmosphere. That's an externality we refuse to deal with as a society because it's a global one, and I don't want to do all the work if China's not going to, or India or Bangladesh or whatever, right? But we're starting to see those costs being burdened on our electric utility systems, wildfire, peak demand, et cetera, et cetera. There's no easy answer for that one, except we have to design, I think, our grids to be more robust, and I think we're going to design them in the future to be more fractal. Like they're still highly centralized, but you're starting to see microgrids emerge. The idea, for example, that people have gas-fired generators from Generac or Kohler, that's kind of a fractal approach. They've given up on the reliability of the grid and made their own investments accordingly if they can afford to. In a future grid, it could look more like a fern leaf where there's all these different sustainable pieces in that larger ecosystem, but they can be broken off and still survive. We're not even close to there yet, but if someone said to me 50 years from now, we might be architecting a grid that looks more like that, aided by AI, that would not surprise me. What would surprise me is that I'm still alive then.
I think I know we're getting close to the end of our conversation. One of the themes that I've kind of picked up throughout this whole conversation is all of these changes have costs. And in the end, those costs are borne by all of us. And, we need to be more thoughtful about what energy we use, how we use it, because at some point or another, those costs do end up back to us. And I don't know if I'm depressed by that thought or emboldened by like we have some control over it. I don't want to end the conversation on a negative note, but it just feels like there's a lot of stuff we're going to have to deal with.
I think you're right about that. And I think, one of the things about AI is the costs come before the value, right? And we don't know what the value looks like, and we don't entirely know what the costs look like. But here's what I think I can confidently assert is, in the beginning, electric light, for example, when Edison came up with Pearl Street Station, that was pretty cool because it replaced gas lighting and gave us the illumination we have. But it's still pretty basic. And then you had your transformers. So now you can create these integrated utilities and you can electrify more and more. And human progress marches hand in hand with the electron. Now, as we move into the digital age, we still, as individual consumers, we get our electric bill, we look at it with disgust, we think of it like a tax, even though without it, we'd be dead in a couple days. I think what we have to do fundamentally is reimagine our relationship with the electron and really honor that thing and understand how critically important it is and start to more as a society more creatively and proactively think about, well, what is it we want from this new emerging digital society where the electron is going to be, in ways it never has been in the past, right at the core of everything we do and who we are. Like the primacy of electricity is, people start talking about India being an electrostate, China being an electrostate. No one even had that phrase 5 years ago. It's here now. And so I think we really have to reimagine our relationship with that flow of electrons and understand where we fit in that. And dare I say, be willing to pay a little bit more for reliability and know it. Like up until now, we've just kind of assumed it. Now we have to know it. And we have to, I think, be much more conscious and aware of what that means, which is perfect for PLMA and its members because the flexibility is inherent in the value of what that thing is and how we use it.
I don't know how to follow that up. This this has been such a fun conversation, and I cannot wait till next year. Then hopefully I get to do this again and keep following up on the conversation. Any last thoughts from you, Judy?
I don't have any other than to tell you guys what an amazingly interesting conversation this has been, and so wide-ranging and so relevant to what our day-to-day looks like. So thank you so much. I think this is one to go back and listen to a second or third time on podcast.
Yeah, I can't wait to go back and listen to it.
Exactly. And so we encourage everybody who's listening here, we will have this on PLMA's YouTube channel and on our podcast, and you will be able to take that and share it with your colleagues and friends. And we will pick the conversation up with Peter again about this time next year. And so Peter Kelly-Detwiler, NorthBridge Energy Partners, thank you so much for your expertise and the really interesting slides and ideas that you brought to us today. And Jenny Roehm, Schneider Electric, awesome job of hosting and facilitating. We appreciate it. And for everybody there still in the audience, let me quickly remind you, next week is Distributech, and it's in San Diego, as you know. PLMA is hosting a one-day symposia with our partner at the symposium, which will be Smart Energy Consumer Collaborative. We'll focus on DERs and customer engagement. Please sign up for that if you're planning to go. And of course, on Tuesday morning, we will have our usual breakfast for all of the PLMA members. The food is free. The drinks are free. They're not alcoholic, but they are still free. And you'll have a great time with networking and just enjoying the start of the new year. And the other thing I want to remind everybody of is we are in the process of calling for nominations for PLMA's 2026 Awards of Excellence, which is always a fun and interesting program. If you have a great initiative that needs to be recognized. We want to hear from you. So please go to our website and take the opportunity to nominate. We'd love to see as many nominations as we possibly can. And with that, let me just say to everybody that you've been listening to a load management dialogue presented by PLMA. And if you'd like to forward it to a friend, as I mentioned, it will be available in a couple of days on our YouTube channel and also on the PLMA podcast. And of course, to learn more about upcoming dialogues and webinars, please take a look at the PLMA calendar at flexload.org or check PLMA's Tuesday weekly e-blast, and you will see them listed there. And at that point, I can say thank you. This concludes this edition. Have a great day, everybody, and we appreciate you joining us. We'll see you soon. Bye for now.